I'm going to start by welcoming everybody to Winescapes with Artists. And so raise a glass, cheers, and
Cheers. You
welcome.
guys are drinking. You guys are drinking early in the day.
Well, you know, it's Friday, so it's
Right.
later for you, but it's definitely early cocktail hour for us.
Yeah.
So I'd like to welcome today's guest, Merry Foresta. She's the Museum of Photographic Arts Curator-at-Large. And I'm your host, Deborah Klochko, Executive Director and Chief Curator at the Museum of Photographic Arts. So we have Merry here today because the next exhibition that we have coming at the museum when we open, whenever that is, will be Aaron Siskind, Mid-Century Modern. And Merry has been the curator for this exhibition, but she's far more than just a curator at large for MOPA. She's an independent curator, an art advisor. She was the director of the Smithsonian Photography Initiative for 10 years, from 2000 to 2010. She also was the first photography curator at the Smithsonian American Museum of Art. Dare I say the date, Merry? 1982. I
Something like
know,
that. Yes.
I know. And so clearly she's has vast experience. I've had the privilege of working with Merry over the years and was very happy when she was willing to come on as our curator at large, giving us an East Coast presence because that's where she's based. And if you can talk a little bit, there's a couple of things I want you to talk about because number one, you actually knew Aaron Siskind.
I
And
did.
so I think that that will be something really wonderful to be able to share with our audience. And then also, I'm trying to remember how we began the idea of doing an Aaron Siskind exhibition at this time. So if you want to start maybe with what it was like to know Aaron Siskind.
Well, let's see. If you knew Aaron Siskind, you and got to spend some time with him, you had a very good time. He was one of the most extroverted people I've ever known. He was, to speak of him physically, he was short. He was what you would describe as a youthful man, burly, and as an older man, he was portly. He had a laugh that was more like a chortle than a belly laugh, and he laughed a lot. He knew lots of people. He loved talking, especially to young people. I think it's an important thing to think about with Aaron is that he had two parallel careers in a way. He was an artist, but he had enormous influence, especially on American photography, because he taught photography. He was part of one of the first very important programs at the Institute of Design in Chicago, what we now know as ID. And he worked with Harry Callahan there for 20 years. And then he also worked for an additional 10 years at the Rhode Island School of Design. And it's not an understatement to say that probably the next 2 or 3 generations of American photography passed through the guidance of Aaron and Harry as well. So he was just a lovely guy to spend time with. He didn't mind talking about his photographs, but like most photographers, and I've discovered this the hard way, he was much more interested in talking about what he was doing today or yesterday than he was talking about the pictures that he had made in the late 1930s or even the 1940s. He was just a wonderful person to spend time with. I never had a bad time with Aaron. I'm thinking about, Deb, if I can just move on to your next question or your next thought, which is how we came up with this Aaron Siskind. I think it goes back to our long association. And I remember that you were working with me. I think you were, I can't remember why, but you were working with me in the 80s when we got a large group at the National Museum of American Art, a large group of Aaron Siskinds that were transferred to us from the National Endowment for the Arts. And I think we had a conversation. I remember talking to you several times saying, you know, Aaron Siskind is one of those really well-known photographers who hasn't had a really good show. And it sort of came up over the years, and now here you are, a person of importance, and so you can direct there to be a really good Aaron Siskind show. And I think that's partly why we put it together. It was an idea that had kind of bounced around and come along for a long time.
Well, part of that was I was interning because I was in graduate school at George Washington University at that time, and for museum education, and I wanted to get back into photography, which is why I was interning with you. And I think the other thing is, having included the few Aaron Siskinds that we have in the collection in exhibitions at the museum, I realized it was just a reminder of how beautiful, how absolutely stunning his work is. And I kept feeling that it was maybe time to rethink and reinvestigate what his work was about. And that's, I think, what you brought to this whole project is that past experience, the knowledge of having talked with him, but also the great ideas that you brought to looking at this particular exhibition. So the Mid-Century Modern is really, this is not a complete retrospective, this exhibition.
No.
And it's very special, and you were adamant in that we include vintage works. Because so much of his work that is available today are larger, more contemporary prints. And so if you want to just talk about some of the process you went through as you began to shape this exhibition.
Well, you're right. I mean, in some ways it would be, so the challenge for Aaron Siskind, I'll just back up a little bit. The challenge for looking at Aaron Siskind is that most everyone, when they encounter the full range of Aaron's work beginning in the late 1930s, and you know, he was a photographer until his death in the early 90s. I mean, so there is a lot of Aaron Siskind to look at. But most people tend to look at it in two chunks, as though he's some sort of bipolar photographer. The early part was very much social documentary work when he worked for the New York Photo League, and that's really where he began his career as a photographer in New York City. And he was director of a very special program at the Photo League called the Feature Group. And the Feature Group was an assembly of photographers who would decide on a subject. Some of the most famous ones would be the Bowery or Broadway Ballyhoo. The very famous one, of course, is Harlem Document. And they would sit and have a conversation about what aspects they wanted to document, and then somebody would go out and do the people, and somebody would go out and do the storefronts, and somebody would go out and do the labor union parades. And Aaron was the head of that. And then perhaps importantly, he was also the person who helped edit the pictures, and maybe most important of all, would install an exhibition of them, so that he was very much involved with how pictures looked on the wall as objects. And this becomes important later on. So that's the early Aaron Siskind. And then there's sort of the middle passage for Aaron, which is where I really thought we should start the show. And that's where I think about what he was going through in the 1940s as he moved from this social documentary, sharp-focused, black and white, people-oriented subject to increasingly abstraction. Aaron cared deeply about people and deeply about the social situation in the United States during the Depression and in a during the war and in a post-World War II world. And he was very much a humanist, and he really transferred that desire to have an effect on the social psychology of a culture from something specific, which he said kind of let us down, to something much more spiritual. And so his transfer from into abstraction was really where I wanted to start the show. And I wanted to keep it to this amazing period of the early 40s to the early 60s, 20 years, where he does some of his most radical work, where he becomes a real abstractionist, where he's most involved with the artists who came to be known as the abstract expressionists, where he was a full participant in that, and in some cases was even in advance of their thinking. He was so articulate, he was so well read that he actually influenced them. And that is such a little known piece of Aaron Siskind, and yet the pictures are among the most radical of American photography at that time. And that's really what I wanted to show in this exhibition.
So we have a slide up now of the Martha Vineyard from 1943. And so there's a couple of things I wanted to point out. One is how he titles his works. It seems to be location, number, and can you address that?
Yeah, I think ultimately what he was doing, and it comes out of the work he did in the projects of the Photo League. You went to a specific location. You went to Broadway. You went to the Bowery. You went to Harlem, and then you took 20 photographs. So here's Harlem 1 through 20, and that's how they organized their projects. I think he carries that over when he ultimately has to distinguish between these abstract works. It's place and number. It's Martha's Vineyard 1. This is, and he tended to work not so much in sequences in the way that you've come to know, say, a minor white sequence. It wasn't quite that. When he began working in places like Martha's Vineyard, he was still his day job during the school year. He was a public school teacher in the New York public schools. He taught English and poetry. And so he had his summers off. And that's when he would go off to places like Martha's Vineyard and spend the summer. And he had a very strict regimen that he followed. He would give himself strict parameters. He would take only so many pieces of film with him, and he would only do 8 pictures a day. So he really had to make sort of pre-decisions about how he was going to use those 8 pictures. And so that became the numbering, that kind of sequence. Now, not all of those 8 pictures would be part of the sequence. So maybe there was 1 out of there, and the next day would be 2, and maybe there wouldn't be any for another 3 weeks. But I think that's how the numbers. So when you see his pictures that say Martha's Vineyard, that's where he took the picture. The number was the number in that year, and then he usually adds the date to the pictures as well.
It's interesting because he's sharing the location, but the work is so abstracted that you really, without that title, you wouldn't know where it is.
You wouldn't know where it is, and to be frank, I don't think you need to know where it is. It gives it another level of context, and maybe it is an entry point. And maybe he felt that, especially in those early pictures, he needed an entry point for a person looking at a photograph to see, to sort of, okay, that's Gloucester, and I see that it's sand. You get clues. So in that particular pictures, you get clues. The other thing that's quite charming about that picture, he did a whole sequence, and he kept returning to this idea of seaweed, like a drawing on a blank background, which is sand. So he would come upon a piece of seaweed, and it would be a lovely drawing, and then he would frame his picture around that. And he did that. He did that for, gosh, nearly 15 or 20 years. He would keep coming back to make more of those kinds of pictures. This is a very early one, and what's so charming about this one, and if you look at a number of Aaron Siskind's images, and we have a few in the show, not that you'll see in this slideshow, he always is looking for the letter A. And so this is a lovely little letter A in the sand. And
for Aaron?
For Aaron. And so sometimes you'll see an A and an S in a picture. And so I think it was, you know, it's the hand of the artist in a way, and in this way, it's the hand of the photographer or the eye of the photographer claiming this space, this flattened abstract space, as his own personal space.
So he was very interested in the flat plane of the picture. So are we seeing in all of his work uncropped images?
No, you're seeing very tightly framed pictures. He was very much about the framing that was necessary when you were in search of a picture.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to really put him in the context of American abstract painting at mid-century, where if you think of Pollock and Willem de Kooning and Franz Klein and Adolf Gottlieb, it was about flattening the space, about allowing people to get into a space only through the guise of certain painting motifs. It was about shapes and forms and creating not a window to the world, but an expression of the world within certain boundaries. And Aaron, at that time, and if you read a number of the things he writes during that time, and he creates several manifestos for himself and for Abstraction, he talks about creating a new object within the frame. And this is a revolutionary idea for photography, that you're not looking through to something, you're not looking into the window towards reality, but you're given another reality within the frame of the photograph. There is some cropping that happens in the darkroom. He was excellent in the darkroom. Not many people know this, because he also was a very generous guy, and towards the end of his life, he would find destitute students who needed work, and he would put them to work in his darkroom. So I think the rumor was that Aaron hated the darkroom and had other people do it, but in fact, that's not true. He was very much a darkroom guy. And so, as you said, one of the reasons that I wanted to add so much vintage material to this work is because you can see this extraordinary printing in these early prints, in these vintage prints.
Why don't we go to the next image?
All right, can you just give me 1 second?
Yes.
There, okay, now I've got the slideshow now too.
Okay, so we're on Gloucester 1H, 1944.
Okay, so if you'll bear with me, let's go back to a little bit of a chronology here. So Aaron shows up in Martha's Vineyard in the beginning of the 40s, and he experiences a fairly radical rethinking of what kind of picture he can make. And in Gloucester, he would walk around and take photographs of fishing shacks and people hauling nets off of boats. And one day, he goes out to a wharf, and he's waiting for the fishing boat to come in, and he looks down. And what he sees when he looks down is an object on the deck of the wharf, and it's an isolated object, and it has a kind of spirituality to him. And this is one of those objects from Gloucester that he makes. It's a glove. It's lying on the wharf, and rather than, what's radical about it are several things. One, rather than pointing his camera out, he points it straight down, and what that does is totally flatten his space, and it makes it a very ambiguous space. Is this glove lying down? Is it floating in the air? Is it hooked on a wall? You don't really know. So now we've created a kind of mystery about this thing, and it's an object that is disembodied from anything else. It's a hand, it's a glove, it has mystery to it. And so what he realizes by doing this kind of work, he removes the image. He doesn't remove it so much. He places it into that mystery kind of space that painters have always claimed. And so he begins a whole series in Gloucester that goes through the mid-40s until about 1947. He's making these kinds of, I'll call them spirit object photographs in a way. And it ultimately culminates in an article he writes for Minicam magazine, which at the time was a magazine that if you had any interest in photography at all, you read this magazine. And in this magazine, he writes an article called The Drama of Objects. And he talks there about how what he's doing is creating a whole new object, new to the world, that this photograph is new to the world. It's not of the world, it's not about the world, but it's new unto itself. Pretty radical again for photography. And he says that what you do is you don't compare this to something in the world, but you deal with its own drama. And so he really thinks about how pictures work, how abstraction works. And from there, he increasingly works with an abstract subject, so much so that I think if you go to the next one, which is Chicago, 1949, by the end of the 40s, he's no longer focusing down at objects. He's focusing closely at pieces of walls, things that are already flat, and framing them so that they have a different reality than their own reality. And he's framing it as an artist to coincide with what he is experiencing emotionally at that moment.
So the painters that he's interacting with, Franz Klein comes to mind. So this is very different because in the past it was always assumed that he was influenced by the painters, and you're stating that it probably was the other way around.
In part, I think what I'm trying to say is that Siskind was very much a part of the dynamic of what was going on. Mm-hmm. He knew these people. They were his friends. In Martha's Vineyard, he went and summered with Adolf Gottlieb. He was friends. He had a studio across the street from Franz Klein. He hung out at the Cedar Bar and the Waldorf Cafeteria with de Kooning and Klein and Pollock. And at these places, at mid-century, and by the late 1940s, there's just a hotbed of American young painters who are all talking about what can possibly be the new American art. We're in a post-war moment. The European immigrants are still hanging around, but their art seems old. What we're looking for is an American moment that is different. And Siskind was very much a part of that conversation. Mm-hmm. There were critics involved as well who were talking about what would it take, what defines America, what is big and bold and dynamic about American art, and how were we going to do it. And Siskind is part of those conversations, a full participant. Siskind, probably more than any of them, was well-read, articulate, could write, and so contributed his voice and his thinking and his ideas in any number of ways. Siskind's only problem, and we don't think because we love photography, it wasn't a problem for us, it wasn't one for him, that he was a photographer. Now, he was a full member of that group, but the work that he produced did not function the way their work did. That said, there were some people who responded very positively to Siskind's work, and one of them was the gallery dealer Charles Egan. Mm-hmm. And long before Pollock or Klein or Gottlieb or de Kooning, had an exhibition in New York. Siskind was having exhibitions at the Charles Egan Gallery. The Egan Gallery was not, Siskind was the only photographer being shown, and he got full exposure at this time that painters were struggling to get someone to pay attention to their art.
So if you look at it, we don't have one here, but within the exhibition in the book, and if you look at an installation of one of his exhibitions at the Egan Gallery, the work is unframed, mounted to the edge. He's hanging it, so he's ordering it in a specific way, which is not a typical linear, completely linear fashion. So he, as you had mentioned before, he had was part of the selection and exhibition process for the Photo League, and now he's doing this with his own work at the Egan Gallery.
Right. So what's interesting about Siskind is he was very much involved with the way images functioned as art on the wall, as objects on the wall. So what he would do, and I don't know, I can be wrong, I never encountered any other photographer who did this, but Siskind did. So what he would do is, as you say, he would mount his photographs. He would mount them on masonite board, quarter-inch masonite board. And there would be no glazing. They would be mounted so straight up to the edge, no mats. And the other part that was interesting is he would put stretcher pieces on the back so that when you put it on the wall, it stood away from the wall. It didn't blend into the wall. It stood, it had dimensionality, much the way painters, and many of them did at this time. It was cheap to paint on masonite. That's the way painters presented their work, and Siskind presented his work in a similar way. The other thing that was extraordinary to me, and this is just, when I saw this image, it sort of blew my mind and made the show come alive for me, is that he also hung not picture, 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 picture in a line, but he saw a wall. He saw hanging pictures in a wall, and he would hang them in a kind of dynamic way. So some images were printed really small, some were big, some were long and horizontal, some were actually quite large. And he would design an entire wall as an installation. So separate works, but all hung together. It made for quite a conversation among these abstract small images. But what it also did was provide him a way to compete and compare with the large paintings that were being presented by the painters.
So that's very interesting to me because you had mentioned Minor White and his sequence of images. You know, on the other coast, on the West Coast, Minor is thinking about similar ideas, at least in terms of how you present works in relationship to one another. And so, and as we think about this, this is a very contemporary, considered a very contemporary approach today, but here it's happening in the 50s. And so influential and not really discussed that much. So it'll be, we're recreating that wall as much as we can in the exhibition, which I think is going to be very exciting.
You know, I think people ask me, like, why are you interested in Siskind now? And it's for exactly that reason, Deb. It's because he so much is this moment as a kind of seed, if you will, for the notion of the installation work that is happening in very contemporary work. I think of Luke Tillman's kind of presentation of his pictures on a wall, or other contemporary photographers who don't think of a single picture, but they think of an array. It's not even a cluster, an array of images that you encounter at one moment. And Siskind seems to mark a moment when there was this correspondence between photography and other art media that 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 was an enormous mix of ideas. I personally like to think that the flatness of photography as part of its very nature led painters to think about flattening the space in their painting. And I think I haven't tracked down a real conversation that I can point to as absolute evidence. No letters back between Siskind and Franz Klein where Klein says, "Thank you, Siskind, for pointing out that I should be flattening my space. Thank you for showing me those pictures." But certainly there was Siskind making images in a flattened space before any of them were painting that way, and they saw his work. Haven't given him credit, but I gotta think that was part of the conversation. There is a kind of apocryphal story of de Kooning being out on the street and seeing a crumpled piece of paper on the street, and it kind of was stuck to the sidewalk. And he apparently said to the person he was with, "That's an Aaron Siskind photo." And he got in touch with Siskind, and he asked to have that photo. And apparently it was in de Kooning's studio for most of the 1940s and 50s. So there you go.
So let's move on to the next slide.
Okay. Which, so compare, these are both from 1949. And really, I think you can see that he's abandoned, for the most part, references to gloves and signs and things. These are about bold graphic designs. And I just think this Chicago 30 is one of his most iconic works, in that it's a kind of movement, black and white. When you actually encounter this image in the exhibition, there's way more texture to it than you see here, and it's really a beautiful, beautiful piece.
Well, as I said, when you see the original prints, there's nothing like them. The level of detail, the quality of the print, the tonalities are really quite special. Can I just say that from a connoisseurship point of view, in terms of Siskind, they're all kind of beautiful, but you really can, because Siskind uses these dense blacks, you can really date some of these pictures because the older papers had so much silver in them that he could really print these dark, dark, velvety blacks. It's different today, but you can really see it in these early vintage prints. Just the blackness of them is quite extraordinary. When we go on to the next slide, and while we're doing that, it's been about a 2+ year process, doing the research, going around, finding the works. But in all of my experience, I've never had so many people, the gallery people, the collectors, be so excited about this exhibition. And so I think the timing is really good. And the fact that the focus is on the earlier vintage prints, but one after the other, the excitement is there. And so I think it's really going to be a spectacular experience.
Yeah, I can't wait to see them all together again. So this is an interesting picture. This is, as you see, it's from 1950, and Aaron goes back. He spends his summers in places like Martha's Vineyard. Sometimes he spends his summers traveling across the country. 1950 is kind of an interesting period for him. It's kind of the height of his involvement with the abstract expressionists. And he goes to Martha's Vineyard, and indeed he's spending time again with a number of them that are also up on the vineyard. And this is a series that he does of rocks. Siskind was hired and spent some time at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, not unlike Walker Evans a little bit earlier, photographing their pre-Columbian sculpture. And he gets inspired by it. And so when he goes to Martha's Vineyard, he begins seeing these formations of rock walls that are there, or natural formations of rocks, and again frames them so that they have a kind of monumentality. In fact, these are very small clusters of things. They're not very big rocks, but Siskind photographs them as if they're huge pre-Columbian archways from some ancient culture, and they're really quite wonderful. This one has particular significance because it was used as the frontispiece for painter and writer and magazine producer Robert Motherwell, who had a magazine called Modern Art, and he used this as the frontispiece for the first edition of that journal. And this was the print that was included among only paintings in a very important exhibition that took place in 1950 in New York. It was one of the first big retrospectives of abstract expressionism. And this picture, I discovered in the course of doing research, was included in that exhibition. The only photographer, the only photograph.
So this is a real departure now, because he's not just going against a flat plane and photographing, you know, what's on the wall, but there's, I assume, sky behind this. Now, is he exposing to get that white background, or is that partially working in the dark?
I'm sure he's exposing to get the white background. He's still dealing with that idea of anonymous space.
Right.
And in this case, there are a number of photographs that do have dimensionality. And I think he's also looking at the idea of sculpture and of architecture. So I should just stop for a second, and here's hopefully not confusing everyone. But the other thing that was really captivating to Siskind, and again, a layover from his work in the city, photographing the architecture of New York, was photographing buildings. And we don't have any in the slideshow right now. There are some in the show that are particularly abstract, but he really was interested in the idea of facades, of the pattern that windows make, of the stonework over a window that repeats and repeats and repeats up and down the facade of a building. And so this idea of architecture, of man-made things, stays with Siskind, and there is this whole sort of subgenre of Siskind that is about facade and building and architecture. And this is, I think, one of the first glimpses we have where he translates the idea of photographing a literal building into the ability of the photograph to change things like scale and contrast in order to make this image that functions like I don't know, like a strange piece of prehistoric, not prehistoric, but pre-Columbian architecture.
So let's go to the next slide.
The next slide is exactly the image that I was referring to. This is the one de Kooning had hanging in his studio for many years, this photograph. And if anybody would like to make comparisons to de Kooning's famous series of women paintings, I think you should look them up and take a look. But this one was in front of that. So this one was before de Kooning started painting his abstract women.
Good. Next slide.
So this image is an example of his traveling photographs and some of the buildings that he became fascinated with. When he retired from public school and went to teach at the Institute of Design in Chicago, he began traveling much more. And to me, what's interesting about Siskind is his ideas are put in his mental suitcase and go along with him. So he photographs in Mexico, he goes to Peru, he goes to Europe, especially Rome, and he finds subjects there that trigger memory for him of some other shapes, some other designs. So there is a kind of connection between all these different places that he goes to, and the connection has to do with shape and form and design. And this would be an example of, we can almost see what caught his eye here in terms of repetition and shape and such.
Light and dark and
all of that.
So next slide. Not that I'm
so
rushing you.
The next slide is a kind of, in a way, concludes our Siskind as a mid-century modernist. In 1961, he began a series of works in San Luis Potosi in Mexico. And the thing that's interesting about it is that he knew his friend Franz Kline was very ill. And as he was driving around looking for his next place he wanted to photograph, he passed a wall. And the wall was covered with posters and splattered with paint. And he said to himself, that's like something Franz Kline would do. That's like something Kline would do. And he let it go, and several days later, he couldn't stop thinking about it, and so he began, he came back and he made several pictures in this place. And I end the show here because it's a reference to that, it sort of concludes a 20-year period. Siskind had published his first big book in 1960. Franz Kline helped him pick the photographs for the book. It's called Aaron Siskind Photographs. The abstract expressionist critic Tom Hess wrote the foreword for it. So it's got some real street cred, this book does, and it's a beautiful, beautiful book of 50 Siskind photographs from the whole period, from the 40s through 1961. This photograph is in that book. And it seemed a good spot to end the parameters of the show. But for the purposes of MOPA's installation, I wanted to do something fairly dramatic that was the leap to one of Siskind's major series of works. So in 1961, in Mexico, he says, that's Kline. Franz Kline died the following year in 1962, and 10 years later, Siskind begins a series of some of his most classic abstract images, and the last two images in your slideshow are from that series. The series is nearly 100 images in its fullness. But I think we've got an installation group of 12 or 14 or something that you'll see. But it is called Homage to Franz Kline. I think it's confused people over the years because they think that he was copying Franz Kline. I think what this is a celebration of and a reminder to the world who was interested in looking at abstract photography is that there was a moment in the 40s and 50s that Siskind was a major player in the world of abstraction. It's an homage not only to Franz Kline and their personal relationship, but I think it's an homage to Siskind's participation in a group where he was a collaborator. He loved to collaborate, where there was a social interaction, there was an aesthetic interaction, where there was a liveliness of ideas exchanged about what art could be. And I think that's what this is an homage to. And it's a lovely series, and I'm glad that we sort of have this as a kind of talisman to end the exhibition with.
I can't wait, especially following the whole process of putting this together. What I'd like to do is take some questions if anybody has them. So does anybody have anything they want to ask Mary? Here's your chance. Okay. Let me just.
I think I've left them all stunned.
No,
No,
but
I really enjoyed this because I didn't know anything about Aaron Siskind. So this is fantastic.
We have some Aaron Siskins in the collection, but again, this is an important exhibition for MOPA to be doing. And as you can see, it's going to be important to the history of the field. And Mary has brought an incredible way of looking and thinking about his work that I think is quite exceptional. And again, you know, I knew Siskind's work, but what we're seeing here is something that is far deeper, far richer than how people normally think about his work.
Well, I also still, you know, however many years on, I still think this work feels and looks very foreign to what a lot of people expect of photography. And I think it's, I think the exhibition, looking at a number of these and thinking about them contextually, not just historically, but in terms of what's going on in photography right now, I think it will engender, I hope it will, a lot of conversations about what does photography mean. It's kind of the driving engine of photography and why we're interested. How do these pictures work? They work in a lot of ways. And how do these kinds of abstract pictures work, I think will broaden the conversation that we have about photography as a whole. I hope it will.
Hello, Mary. Graham Howe. I have a question.
Yeah.
You didn't mention Achille Gorky. Is there a connection with Siskind and Gorky? Because he seems to be integral to that mix, because Gorky is, of course, part of all the early ABEX, proto-ABEX guys. Was there a connection?
Not a specific personal one. Certainly they knew each other because, of course, Gorky was kind of the leader of the pack for a while amongst those young American painters. Gorky was the one who kind of got a lot of conversations going, and I'm sure Siskind knew Gorky to the extent that Gorky brought with him from Europe and probably was the greatest advocate for and teacher of to the young American artists an idea of what European surrealism was about, the idea of that kind of mystery and disjuncture of image. And Siskind certainly drank from that cup of surrealism a great deal. I mean, if we just look at that glove, if it's nothing, it's surreal. And I think he probably appreciated Gorky, but I can't tell you that I know that they spent a great deal of time personally together.
They had to both. I mean, Gorky had a studio in Lower Manhattan during the time of the Photo League, and also a place out in Martha's Vineyard where he spent.
Well, then they must have. It's there, and it's a hint, and I will go and see what I can find. But I haven't encountered a real a real sense of that. If it was there, you know, Siskind was very much a friend of the Gottliebs, and to the extent that Gorky and Gottlieb hung out together, I'm sure Siskind did. But I'll give it a shot. I'll let you know the next time we talk.
One other name, if you're doing your forensics on this, is Hans Burkhardt. Hans worked in
Absolutely.
the studio of Gorky from 1929 through 1937,
Yeah.
and in 1937 he moved to Los Angeles. But I'm wondering if there's any connection between Siskind and Burkhardt. Burkhardt was a Swiss national.
And yes, well, I do know that there was, because Burkhardt was also great friends with Max Yavno. And
No.
Yavno and Siskind shared a studio for a time in New York. And Siskind would often come to Los Angeles and visit with Yavno, and I'm sure Burkhardt was a part of that too.
That's a great piece of evidence. Thank you.
We aim to please, Graham. We aim to please.
Well, that's great about Gorky. I feel remiss now. I'm going to seek out Gorky and Siskind and see what I can come up with.
You can always add it to the wall text. The book is kind of done.
The book's done, but all right.
If you go to Hauser and Wirth's website, there's a very nice video they just put up last week on Achille Gorky painting the garden in Martha's Vineyard.
Oh.
It's a short video, but it's really well done.
Yeah.
Maybe some clues there.
Could be. By the way, if you haven't read it, I'm reading this fascinating book. It's called The Ninth Street Women. And it has to do mostly with women who were the painters who were often married to these people. Lee Krasner and Elaine de Kooning and Grace Hardigan. But in this book is more information about the downtown artist scene of the 40s and 50s than I have ever read anywhere else. And Gorky certainly figures a lot there.
Wow.
But I recommend this book to you if you're interested in that period.
Absolutely.
It focuses on the women, but everybody else is in there too. So it's just a great book.
The women do it better anyway.
Yeah.
So, any other questions?
I just had a question.
Yes, Robert.
Robert. Did he ever talk about how he came upon some of these images, like the last two? Because I'm just curious about how his mind worked, and he must have been, as all photographers are, very alert, but also looking for compositions that sort of fit in with what he was trying to create. But you really have to have a lot of focus. You really have to your eyes have to be constantly looking around. And I just wondered, did he ever write about how he, the moments he came upon these images, or what his process was in looking for these shots?
I can answer that only by saying that what he wrote about was a little bit about what he felt while making these images. And I can tell you a little bit about the way he works. He wasn't a kind of grab and go. He didn't sort of drive by, oh, that looks good, grab that. He would walk around a lot. He would walk around the same place a lot. He might see something. It would stick with him. He'd come back 2 days later. He might look at it again. So a lot of these images are ones that were very particular to him and were very much a process of framing. It took him a long time to make a photograph. Some of the assistants that he took along with him when he made these usually were students, usually in the summer, and they've given interviews, or I've talked to them, and they said, Todd, we just would wait forever for Aaron to make a photograph. He just sat there, and then he would stand there. It would be like 110 degrees in Mexico with this black cloth over his head, and we would just think he'd passed out in there or something. And then he would finally make the image. So it was a process. Making an image was a process, and I think the other process, and he talks about this a lot, is that in his mind he had a kind of catalog of images, And he often talked about how images relate to other images. And he felt that he was instructed by earlier images that he had made. So that each image, in a way, intellectually, is a accumulation of all the images that he's made before it. Is that too metaphysical for you? I don't know, but I think what I'd like to leave you with is that each one was a consideration. It wasn't just that's an interesting design, I'll take that.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course the other part is editing afterwards. I mean, he may have made many pictures that were like these, but this was the one he chose, and this was the one he printed.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Deborah, when are you opening?
Oh, whenever we're allowed. So this exhibition is scheduled for this year. We may be moving it a little bit later in the year, but it is happening. So, and again, there is a book, so it will always be captured. And I have a,
but we just
yeah.
heard about the prints.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need the prints. You really need the prints.
You do, you do. So you'll just have to be patient, and just know that it's coming. So that's part of what we wanted to do is give you a preview of what's to come. So I want to thank everyone that joined us today. I want to thank Mary for sharing. And I also want to let you know that next week's guest is the artist Joe Whaley, based in Santa Fe. And we've done an individual exhibition of Joe's work. We've included her in a number of exhibitions that we've done. And she will be talking about the exhibition that she had recently, just last year, at the George O'Keeffe Museum, which was a juxtaposition of her photographs and George O'Keeffe paintings.
Great.
So again, applause to all of you, and to Merry Foresta especially.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, thank you.
Me, and I'll see you when I see you.
Okay. All right. Thank you all.
Goodbye. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you.
Deborah.
Stop video.
Thank you, Deborah.
Yes, Connie. Bye.
Bye.